Hello, and welcome to Fictional Science, Imagining Healthy Futures for All, co-presented by AIDS Foundation Chicago. My name is Angel Moore, and I'm the Special Events and Committees Manager at Community Health. Community Health is the largest volunteer-based free health clinic in the United States. We provide primary and specialty care, prescription medications, mental health and dental services, health education and labs, including COVID testing and vaccines, on the west side of Chicago. Our patients have no health insurance, and we provide all of our services to them at no charge. We do this with the support of over 1,000 volunteers, partnerships with dozens of institutions, and donations from generous people like you. Thank you for being here and for supporting Community Health. I would especially like to recognize our many sponsors who are supporting this year's All-In series, including Baxter, AbbVie, Lundbeck, the Joseph and Bessie Feinberg Foundation, West Monroe Partners, and many others. I encourage you to visit our website, allinchicago.org, to see the complete list of sponsors, read the bios of our incredible speakers, and check out the rest of the month's events. Finally, I want to recognize this year's All-In Executive Leadership Council. We have the privilege of having 4 outstanding leaders serving on the council this year. Their great insights and support have been instrumental in bringing this year's series to life. Thank you to Dr. Jay Bott, Mark Ishog, Brian Marcella, and Dr. Julie Morita for your contributions this year. The goal of the All in Chicago series is to bring together leaders from many different industries and segments of our population to talk about how we can work together to ensure every resident has access to the right care in the right place at the right time. Community Health has been hosting all-in events discussing access to healthcare in Chicago since 2015. This year, as we continue to navigate a global pandemic, the conversation on access feels as relevant as ever. COVID-19 has brought on many challenges to leading our healthcare organizations and our home lives. Our panel today has been meeting and overcoming these challenges in the impressive ways they have done their entire careers. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Kim Hunt. Kim is the Executive Director of Pride Action Tank. Pride Action Tank is a social justice lab devoted to improving outcomes for LGBTQ communities through a collaborative process of inquiry, advocacy, and action. Pride Action Tank is a project of the AIDS Foundation Chicago, our co-presenter for today's discussion. With no further ado, I will hand things over to Kim to frame things up and introduce our panelists. Thank you for being here, Kim.
Thank you so much, Angel, and thank you to Community Health and All In Chicago for in reaching out to us to organize this panel, and to you specifically, Angel, for herding all of these cats, because you got 4 amazing folks who are doing a lot of things in the community. So thank you so much for your assistance. So before I introduce the panel, I want to explain where we were coming from as we thought about today's discussion. So my co-conspirator and friend, Aisha Davis, who is part of the panel, and I discussed the possibility of having a conversation that looked at the intersections of oppression as well as the possibilities for a future where liberation isn't a dream, but a reality. Thus the title of today's session. Our premise is that the medical landscape has never included enough data or research about oppressed communities, nor have we had many real opportunities to build trust in the medical industry. And given its history of neglect and frankly torture of BIPOC bodies, additionally, for many oppressed groups, the only spaces where we are able to imagine a life without oppression is in fiction, especially science fiction. So this panel marries the love that Aisha and I have of sci-fi that includes BIPOC people in the future, because many science fiction stories do not include BIPOC folks in the future, as well as our love for public policy. And furthermore, after we actually submitted this panel proposal, we co-organized a summit called Co-Creating Futures, a BIPOC LGBTQ policy and practice summit that included the question, what does a healthy future look like? So this topic is heavy on our minds. And by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't say that day 3 of that summit is September 22nd. So be on the lookout for information. And with that, I'll introduce you to our amazing panelists so we can jump into this juicy conversation. So the first person I'll introduce is Aisha N. Davis, Esquire. Aisha is an LGBTQ plus advocate joining us in her brand new position as a policy director at the Black to the Future Action Fund. As an avid student of intersectionality, Aisha has worked on civil rights, human rights, and equity issues throughout her legal career, including work with Amnesty International, the Human Rights Foundation, Columbia Law School Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, the African American Policy Forum, Lambda Legal, Lovie and Lovie, Howard Brown, and most recently, AIDS Foundation Chicago. Since her move to Chicago, Aisha has continued this mission through as vice president of the board, now president of the board of directors for Affinity Community Services, a member of the board of directors for the Public Health Institute of Metropolitan Chicago, as well as with her work with the Pride Action Tank. Our next panelist is Chef Fresh, who is the director of Chicago Bread Club and founder of Fresher Together. Fresher Together is a collaborative food and farming project for healing, economic development, training, and retreat. Chef Fresh proudly serves as board chair for Howard Brown Health and is the financial board steward for Transformative Justice Law Project. She is passionate around creating an accessible and pleasurable food system and world that supports our complete well-being. And then last but certainly not least is Avatara Smith-Carrington, who is a staff attorney in the Dallas office of Lambda Legal, where they previously served as the Tyrone Garner Memorial Law Fellow. Avatara's current casework includes serving as lead counsel in Fain versus Crouch, a federal lawsuit challenging West Virginia's blanket exclusion of coverage for gender nonconforming care in its state health insurance plans, counsel with BPJ, the West Virginia Board of Education, a federal lawsuit challenging West Virginia's law banning girls and women who are transgender from participating in school sports, and counsel in the Diversity Center v. Trump. Wow, let's welcome all of our panelists. Just reading these bios is just amazing to me. But before we get started, I just want to remind those of you watching that you can submit questions for the panelists using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Or the Q&A function, my bad, at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to write in questions at any time. I will ask as many as I can during the program. Also, I just want folks to know I live across the street from a fire station, so you may hear a siren from time to time. And also, most of us are still working from home, so there's no need to apologize if your child or other loved one, including pets, pop into the frame. Everyone gets special dispensation for these interruptions. All right, so let us now jump into this juicy conversation with these amazing folks. So the first question I want to ask is a big one, and it comes from the summit that I mentioned earlier. And that is, what does a healthy future look like to you? And I am going to start with my buddy Aisha Davis on that question.
Thank you. It's really great to be a part of this conversation. A healthy future, honestly, is one where there isn't a fear of being able to move about the world the way that you want to. So I think that for me includes not fearing what laws are standing in the way of you accessing care, like the ones that Avatara is fighting against. That includes a lack of a fear of how you'll be able to access the food that will nourish you, which is what Chef Fresh is helping us to do, you know? And it also includes the freedom to, I guess, experience joy and pleasure and do so without having to compromise who you are. and being able to bring your full self into the room. And I think that because we are where we are right now, and I told Kim this earlier, I have a quote that I want to share with folks from one of my favorite authors, Octavia Butler. I think that when we're thinking about this future and trying to strive towards it, we have to remember where we are in the present. And so like, I'm just going to share this quote because I think it really does kind of ground my understanding of how we get to that healthy future. So in Parable of the Sower, Octavia Butler wrote, "That's all anybody can do right now. Live, hold out, survive. I don't know whether good times are coming back again, but I know that won't matter if we don't survive these times." And I feel like right now with the changes in laws, especially in Texas, with that brand new abortion law, with the ways that we're losing some of those eviction moratorium protections in the midst of a pandemic that is still happening, the ways that people are losing their unemployment benefits. I think that we have to remind ourselves that yes, we need to survive. We need to hold on, because without doing that, that future that we're dreaming up and imagining can't actually occur, because the healthy future that I envision includes everyone on this panel. And I can't have that future if my people aren't able to kind of hold on and make it through where we are right now. So I think that the healthy future that I envision and can imagine is one where we don't have to be afraid, and we can just lean into all the beautiful and amazing things that we are.
I really appreciate you naming that. In addition to saying what the vision is, we also have to talk about this moment and move to this moment. I was going to say intact, but I don't know if that's possible.
Right.
But to make it to the future, yeah, and you also described Nina Simone's version of freedom, not being afraid. So thank you for that. So Avatara, how about you? What does a healthy future look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, I think a healthy future is one where folks don't have to worry about surviving, but just thriving in general. And I think that, as I look out and see what's currently happening and why hope can happen for, the communities that I'm accountable to in the future, is that folks can live their best and fullest lives without their identities impacting the way that they access different things. So everything from, food to healthcare in all its various ways. So not only talking about healthcare in the physical sense, but also like in, the mental health sense as well. And I think that sometimes what that also requires is making sure that these systems are set up to serve those who are often most impacted or most disenfranchised. So, in many ways, I think of okay, if we're going to talk about a healthy future has to have almost every resource that's needed in order to ensure that when you've looked at, folks historically and in the present, who has kind of been the least served, that's who we're prioritizing as we move forward. Thinking about, and specifically in the work that I do, I'm always thinking about, well, who often has or is forced to bear the force of all the bad things, right? So often that's Black and Indigenous folks, that's transgender non-conforming folks. Those are folks who have immigrated to this country. My dad's an immigrant, so I often think about how that plays into access as well. So it's thinking about all the folks who kind of come with this beautiful holding together of identities, and making sure that they have everything that they need in order to thrive, and that they don't have to worry about the identities that they hold impacting the way that they're going to access these services, or impact the way that they can also advocate for themselves. Because I think that also a healthy future often looks like listening to the wisdom of folks who have often had to create kind of the playbook for the care that they get, because of the fact that so often these systems are not built for them. So they typically come already prepared with like, well, no, this is actually how I need you to take care of me. This is how I need you to show up for me. And when we're talking about specifically healthcare in like its holistic way, like you need to listen to me because I am the best person often who is informed in terms of like the care that I need to receive in order to thrive. So I think that that's what a healthy future looks like for me.
I love that aspect of centering the people who are least served by the healthcare system. And I want to come back to that in a little bit. But I love also that you mentioned this playbook for care, because folks have had to figure out a lot. And, that speaks to an overused word, resilience. We shouldn't, resilience is a great attribute to have, but we don't want folks to have to rely on their own individual resilience to move through a system. But this playbook is a very real outcome of the fact that there are so many people who are not properly served. Thank you for that. Chef Fresh, what about you? What does a healthy future look like to you?
Yeah, thanks. It's so much of what both of them have just said. And so a lot of my vision of a healthy future includes all of that. And, I have all types of dreams of being both able to access like really lush green spaces where I can grow food or just relax or just be, and also have what I need in urban spaces. And so when I think about like healthy futures, the first thing that I think about is what's healthy for me, right? What's healthy. And I think about what nourishes and takes care of my complete self and my whole self, my whole well-being. And I often do this check-in like with my partners and with my friends. That I think about is when I think about health and well-being, and we call it pies. Because also pies are delicious and healthy, but it stands for physical. And so I think about like, are my physical needs being met? Am I at even enough peace to be able to sleep? Am I drinking water? Am I having access to food? All of those things that I need physically, healthcare, all of those things. I as intellectual, are my intellectual needs being met? All of the things that come with that. Do I even have space and time to read and like have these conversations and all of those things that I need that take care and nourish me. E is for my emotional needs. For me, a lot of that means I have access to therapy. Like I get to talk to my therapist every week. Like, what is it? Am I having good conversations? All of those things that kind of help and support my emotional needs. And then the S, I like to think about like 3 S's. So I think about my spiritual needs, my sexual needs, and my social needs. And so when I think about like what a healthy future looks like for me, I think about all of those things being taken care of and being nourished for myself and for my people, right? And I think about like what it feels like to just be free, like in the ways that both of them mentioned before, and like being able to just kind of bring my whole self to the table. And then like I personally just visualize, me and my people, my community, my family having access to green space because of the nourishing ability of the land and like what it can provide for us, and just that ability to like rest and restore and heal. So those are some of the things I think about.
I love that. I will never forget the pies. I've heard the S stop at spiritual, but I love your additions. And I also love that you mentioned green space, because I think, Black people in particular in America have a troubled kind of relationship with the land, right? On the one hand, many folks were brought here from parts of Africa to work the land for the benefit of the powers that be. And that has been a lasting legacy in so many ways. And then the idea of the land and us not having a specific tie back to Africa, not knowing where we've come from, but also all the things that creative things we've been able to do on land. And part of our liberation and freedom, if you will, has come from owning the land, right? And working the land for self and for community. So thank you so much for bringing up those pieces. I want to now shift a little bit to something that Avatara mentioned about really working to set up healthcare systems to serve those who are least served. And I know this connects directly to your work too, Avatara. So we'll start with you, but also want the Chef Fresh and Aisha to jump in on that. And so let's talk about how anti-trans and homophobic legislation create additional barriers to accessing healthcare.
I think that Avatar might be having some tech issues because I see that their image is frozen.
Yes.
But while they figure that out, I'm happy to jump in and talk about that. So as you can tell from my title, I have Esquire at the end of my name because I'm a lawyer. And one of the things that I've worked on over the years is this piece around how legislators and the people who are actually elected to represent every person in their community, right, have created these laws, policies, and regulations that specifically target and harm trans and non-binary people, especially. So I know a lot of times when we talk about legislation and laws, we tend to talk about LGBTQ plus communities as a whole, but I really want to name that right now we're seeing an influx of laws, policies, and regulations that specifically target and harm trans and non-binary folks. When you mention the cases that Avatara is lead counsel on, it includes those where we see school districts who are trying to say that trans students can't participate on the teams of the gender with which they identify. We're seeing that healthcare spaces are not actually providing coverage for gender affirming procedures and care. And this is something that we worked on and tried to figure out. And one story that I'll share is in terms of like how this impacts access to health and what that means for people's lives and livelihood. Here in Illinois, I want to say in 2019, near the beginning of Governor Pritzker's administration, one of the first things that happened was this change in Illinois' Medicaid laws around providing coverage for all gender affirming procedures. In the process of trying to figure out what this policy should look like and how this regulation should be applied, we spoke to a number of experts. We've talked to providers, we talked to community members, and we really wanted to make sure we talked to as many community members as possible because that's the other piece of this. Care looks different for different people, right? My needs aren't the same as Kim's needs, aren't the same as Chef Fresh's needs, aren't the same as Avatara's needs, right? So what we wanted to do was figure out how to create a policy that was broad enough to capture all of the needs of this very diverse and very beautiful community without us kind of signaling or like putting up these flags or red flags that people who might not want this coverage to happen, like to shoot down or target, right? So in the process of creating this regulation, we looked to other states that had updated their laws to provide coverage for gender affirming care. And a lot of them included language like, the coverage does not extend to cosmetic procedures. And when we think about that's really, it's really harmful and it's a really painful thing to include in a regulation because the idea that the way that I want to look and how I want to move about the world can be deemed cosmetic and not necessary and can then be written off and not covered means that I have to bear the brunt of what it means to move about in this world in a way that is not safe for me, in a way that impacts my mental and physical health, and in a way that might cut off my ability to actually cover or pay for or have access to other things that I need. So if I'm a person who feels safest when I'm able to walk around the world and know that I don't have to worry about facial hair, for example, right? That might make me feel safest, that might make me feel most comfortable, and that might make my mental health a lot better than it had been in the past. In some states, that the idea of having some kind of laser hair removal being considered cosmetic directly impacts trans and non-binary people who want to access that kind of care for any number of reasons, right? So when we're thinking about the ways that these laws, policies, and regulations impact and directly harm our communities, we have to remember that there are things that you probably haven't even thought about that somebody else has had to contend with on a daily basis. There are things that might not feel important to you, but are extremely important to other people that we have to figure out how to navigate around. And so the ways that laws and policies have been put in place to either diminish access, limit resources, or just flat out prevent people from entering certain spaces, it has harmed our communities in so many ways. And I'm gonna actually pass it to Avatara in a second, but I think that we have to remember that in a lot of ways, the only way to fix these issues and to correct these laws and policies is to not only listen to our communities, but actually let those communities lead. We could not have changed that policy here in Illinois in a successful and like positive, and I think as broadly as we did without having talked to our community, right? Because my experience, any one person's experience is not representative of our entire community. And when we're thinking about the ways that laws are used to, I don't know, create these walls and obstacles, the best way forward, in my opinion, is to listen to and follow the lead of the folks who are most directly impacted by what's being changed. So I'll pause here. And I don't know if Avatara heard the question. Kim, do you mind repeating it?
Yeah, I will do that. And thank you for that, Aisha. How does anti-trans and homophobic legislation create additional barriers to healthcare access? And welcome back, Avatara.
Yeah, thank you. I always fear that this is going to happen during a panel, and it just so happened that it happened during this panel. And I was like, no, I don't know how to do this. Yeah, I like to talk about this in a very like tangible way, and specifically thinking about the work that I'm currently doing. So as you mentioned, I'm technically counsel on Fame versus Crouch, which is our challenge to an exclusion in the state health plans in West Virginia. And what really, I mean, the whole challenge in and of itself is really great, but what I specifically think about is the work that we're doing on behalf of Medicaid participants. And the reason why I bring that up is because that has highlighted for me what happens when what seems like one barrier becomes multiple barriers. So what I see then, specifically in thinking about Medicaid participants, is that you're already talking about a community of folks who, because of just the way that we understand the economic situation to be, relying on this, support system to help with, accessing healthcare, right? And then in addition to that, the healthcare, well, I guess like the health plan that they have has an exclusion. So pretty much the exclusion, and this is not particular to West Virginia, you can find these exclusions pretty much all over. And unfortunately, especially sometimes in Medicaid plans. And so, these exclusions can be as broad as, banning all kinds of gender confirming care, or like really specific. But the reason why I bring that up is because the minute that that person who's a Medicaid participant hits the exclusion, what then becomes kind of the thought process is like, well, how do I afford care? Because the care that should be covered for me is not covered, which means that I have a choice, but really it's no choice. I can either pay out of pocket for this care that I need, that's medically necessary, or I could forego this care and know that it's going to have, negative consequences on my health and well-being. And so I bring this up specifically in the context of Medicaid participants, because again, you're already talking about folks who, and I like to talk about this also in the space that we're in right now with COVID-19. We're in a space where people are already in precarious positions with their employment. We already know that when it comes to trans and non-binary, gender non-conforming folks, not only are they sometimes typically precariously employed, but also underemployed. And so when you're talking about that, coupled with the fact that you're a Medicaid participant, so you're supposed to have this health plan, but the health plan isn't working for you, then there goes that. And then, unfortunately, what you'll also see, and in the conversations I've had with folks, is that the situation is really dire, because it's just like, well, do I pay rent, or do I get my medication? Do I Do I, there are just like so many things that people just don't think about. And it's so frustrating sometimes because it's not as simple as like, oh, well, then just pay for your healthcare. It's like, no, actually, this means I don't get this meal today. This means that I don't actually have the money to get to my job today. And so I talk about that because when you look at a lot of this, like, anti-trans, specifically anti-trans legislation, what often happens is that it's not just one barrier. There are multiple barriers that you're actually erecting because now these are the decisions people have to make in order to determine whether or not they're going to survive. And unfortunately, I'm so sorry I wasn't able to hear what Aisha was saying, but I think to kind of like tie this all up, what frustrates me is the fact that we don't think about the long-term health consequences that this has for a community. And I'm not only talking about trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming specifically, but the minute that you start cutting away people's access to healthcare, and a pandemic like now, it impacts other things as well. So often I'll talk to folks who, you can't access, hormones or, surgical care, but it also impacts the way that they're accessing their doctors in general. It's also determining the conversations that they're having with their doctors. And also, and I'm gonna wind this up, but the thing that frustrates me is that when we pass legislation like this, or when we have policies and practices like this, what this means then is that it also kind of encourages sometimes healthcare providers or communities or other folks to make decisions to deny care. And again, we're in a pandemic. What does that mean? That means that people are not actually being served and provided for in the way that they need to be served and provided for in order to like thrive. And I think that that's so unfortunate because, people like to whittle it down to this one simple thing, and it's not that simple. And in fact, it's like a chain in the community that we are that gets broken. And what that means is that if one person is not well, we're all not well.
All right now. Yes, you've named many things, and I'll say that Pride Action Tank did a needs assessment of Southside LGBTQ community late last year, and people named that they were making those kind of choices that you just brought up, Avatara, in very real ways. So that and to your point about the long-term impacts of just us not as a society not as being as mindful about that as we should be is really disheartening and short-sighted too. So thank you for that. Chef Fresh, how about you? How do these laws create additional barriers to healthcare access? As someone who's the board chair at Howard Brown.
Well, I won't add much because I think that Aisha and Avatara said so much stuff so well. But some of the things that I think about for this one too is even those policies and laws and all of those things that kind of indirectly affect people's health and well-being and their access. And so, right now, one of the things that TJLP has been fighting is for this ability for folks who have a record to be able to change their name. And, some of the stories that people have shared are, talk about like their well-being and their safety and, feeling like all this added stress and not being able to have their name and have things reflect how they identify. And so I think about that as in terms of that well-being. And I know recently, I was at something where Pritzker was signing, a bunch of laws and, some antiquated things around, HIV and AIDS, but also some stuff that really impacted, me and my family and how we plan to navigate family planning, and so all of these things and these policies, and I definitely look toward people like, the other two panelists for direction around policy and what I should be paying attention to, because I don't always know all the details of those. But those kind of things like that often for me show up, when I don't even know that those things exist, and I don't even know that those things are gonna be a barrier, and then they show up as a barrier for myself or for people I love and people in my community.
Yeah, thank you for that addition. And the slate of bills that Governor Pritzker signed, and you mentioned one of them, Chef Fresh, was the repeal of the HIV criminalization law in Illinois, only the second state in the country to repeal its law. Texas was the first, believe it or not, because that too has been a huge healthcare access, right? When folks could be criminalized for knowing their HIV status, that doesn't encourage people to be tested and then to get into care. So thank you for that. I also want to share that while we talked about legislation and Avatara, you mentioned practices. Part of the challenge too is that the healthcare sector has done some real harm to trans folks when they show up for healthcare, from the moment they encounter security or reception at the front desk, all the way through and past seeing service providers. And when I say harm, being denied service, just getting in the door, as well as receiving inhumane treatment that makes people not want to return for follow-ups. So there's some real consequences, both the laws and the practices that we've been seeing that need to be addressed. So let's shift gears here, and we'll start with you, Chef Fresh, on this one. And I do want to remind folks that at about 11:50, we're going to 11:50? Yeah, 11:50. We're going to take a pause for Q&A. So please put your questions and comments in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. So how can we, let me look at my question there. How does access to food increase or play a part in a healthy future? Chef Fresh, this is all you, but others can feel free to jump in.
Yeah. To me, I think about things like food as just being so foundational, right? So I think about it in a lot of different ways, but one of the basic is fuel, right? Like it's fuel is what this energy that we need to go and to be able to do things. Like, if my car is on empty, like I can't drive somewhere, right? I can't get anywhere. And so I think about that when I think about food and like our future. Like, how can I even begin to start thinking about other things, or working or organizing or moving or building with my community if I can't even eat, and I can't feed my family and nourish myself, right? And so I think about that piece of having access to not only just food, but a choice around food, like a quality food, like this ability to have access to fresh food and grains and like all of these things, as I think about like what it is that is how I put fuel in my tank, right? Like and thinking about the quality of fuel that I put in my tank. Like I used to put cheap gas in my car at one point and the car would be knocking or having trouble, and I feel like that is a part of it too, right? Like I can put all kinds of fuel in my car and it'll get me moving oftentimes, but I think about that quality of food and the access of food and how that takes care and nourishes me for like my longevity and my future. And so that feels like a piece of just at the basic level when I think about healthy futures. But I also think about everything that comes along with food, right? And access to food and like the social pieces and like cooking together or sharing meals or, having this ability to feel like, that food isn't a barrier to coming together and doing all of these things. And that to me feels like a good key part of our healthy futures too. So, I think about those and like all of these different levels, but those are kind of some of the basics is, what does it look like to have a choice around food? What does it look like to have access to food that actually feels nourishing and that takes care of me and that meets my dietary restrictions or meets my like, diet related health needs that I might have and to be able to, access that. Like if my doctor is telling me one thing, like, oh, you might need more protein or more fiber or this to regulate your blood sugar. Like how can I then translate that to having access to that food if that is going to impact and support me with my health and my well-being? So yeah, I just think about those pieces and how that contributes to our healthy future.
And I just
Thank
want
you
to
for
jump
that.
in on.
Yeah, I was going to say, jump on in there, Aisha. I know you're ready.
I just want to jump in on one thing, especially that Chef Fresh just named, which is that this idea of food as fuel playing a piece in our longevity, right? And one of the other things that we're thinking about when we're talking about what our futures look like in being healthy is actually being able to see our people around in our futures. All of those different statistics around the disproportionate representation of communities of color, of queer communities, of trans communities, being overrepresented in very negative statistics, right? High blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, all of these things. It often means that we don't see ourselves in the future, nor do we see our parents, our grandparents, our aunts, uncles, any elders in our community in that future. The expectation of losing people in their 50s, 60s, maybe not even making it to their 70s, right? It plays a part in our day-to-day. It impacts our mental health. It also really impacts the way that we can plan for families and futures, right? Like what Chef Fresh was talking about earlier. How can we be expected to be able to accurately plan for a family if we don't know if we're going to be there to see that family grow? And a big piece of this is just having access to basic things like food. When we're talking about food deserts, when we're talking about, and I don't even like calling it a food desert because a desert is a naturally occurring ecosystem, right? I've heard the term food apartheid, right? These are specific, purposeful ways that food, access to very nourishing things, is being denied to our communities. And I also just want to go back to another thing I said, right? Our representation, our overrepresentation in a lot of these statistics is not about us, right? There's nothing inherently unhealthy about our communities. There's nothing inherently unhealthy about our recipes, about the foods, the things that are passed down through our generations, right? There's nothing inherently unhealthy about that. It's about what is being constructed around us, what we're being forced into, what we're being denied access to that leads to these statistics. And that's something that's come up not only in conversations around the COVID-19 pandemic or the HIV epidemic or any other of these healthcare issues that we see. It's this idea that, well, these communities are overrepresented, so how do we educate them or how do we tell them about that? We know what this means. We know specifically and very intimately the impact of diabetes, the impact of high blood pressure. So it's not about us being talked down to or condescended to, right? It's not about us being blamed or told that we are doing the thing to make ourselves unhealthy. It's about recognizing that systems in our society have been set up and are continuing and perpetuating a status quo that permits white supremacy to thrive and flourish. And until we're able to flip that on its head and really envision and execute a future where that's not the case, we're going to keep seeing ourselves in these spaces. And so I think that one of the ways that we can really think about figuring that out and really envisioning that sci-fi future where we actually exist is by creating these pathways to access to resources, right? Like creating these spaces that we're taking back the access. We're like purposefully trying to take over the reins of these things, like having a farm like Chef Fresh, like distributing food, like sharing recipes, like fighting these laws like Avatara does, right? Like it's all of these things have to work in conjunction for us to even begin to see the beginnings of that future.
Thank you for that addition, Aisha. And I want to come back to some of what you raised in just a little bit, but first want to give Avatara opportunity to answer the question if they want to.
No, I was just Chef Fresh and Aisha like did an amazing job like weaving this together. But the one thing that I heard Chef Fresh say was specifically choice. And that like hit really like close for me because I'm like, so often there is like a lack of choice because of how these systems are created to function. And so what is like seen as for other folks who are outside who don't have to actually, deal with these like, really discriminatory systems is, that there's this appearance of choice, but we know that that's not the case. And I think about that oftentimes in terms of like all the different things that we go through when we're just trying to, again, like, thrive. It's just like how much of this is actually choice versus like this is actually just what we're being handed, and how that plays into like bodily autonomy in terms of like, well, can I actually have a choice in what I'm consuming? Can I actually have a choice in what I'm producing? Can I actually have a choice in the care that I'm receiving? And so that was the biggest thing for me, is just like, when I think about food and like food as fuel, I'm just like, well, what is the choice that I'm making versus the kind of what I'm being handed? And based on where I'm at, what does that mean in terms of my longevity? What does that mean in terms of the health of my community? Because if we are denied, constantly the choice to actually choose what is best for ourselves, then what does that mean in terms of like, where we go from there? Because then out of that, which I, again, kind of goes into the resilience thing, is just like, it's beautiful because we will figure it out, but we shouldn't be forced to figure it out. Like we should be able to, in the same way we're talking about creating a healthy future, we should be able to create a healthy future with choice, with like autonomy, with the ability to be well resourced and well fed. And so like that is the biggest thing. It's like I heard food and choice and fuel, and I'm like, yeah, and if those things aren't together, what does that mean? It means that we don't have what we need to actually thrive.
Wow, great additions. And I want to segue into maybe one more question, but first, let's just pause right now for any questions from the audience. I don't see any in the Q&A box, but folks may. Okay, let me give you a few more minutes to formulate your questions if you have some. But so let's pick up on these threads that have been presented with these questions, and the last question and some of the others as well. So we know that local politics plays a big part of, access to healthcare, despite what happens at the federal level, or sometimes because of what happens at the federal level. Um, so, let's dig into that a little bit. How can we ensure a healthy future when local politics plays such a large role in what is available and determines what choice looks like? But also, going back to something Aisha mentioned too, what does it look like when we, the collective, take control of resources in our own community? So both what happens with the local politics and its impact, but also what we as a collective can do, can take control of resources, that might look like. So Avatara, let's just pick up on where you left off there.
Yeah.
and then we'll do Aisha and Chef Fresh.
Yeah. I mean, it's wild to me how often like folks don't recognize how important the local is versus like, and I'm talking about like local in terms of like municipal, city, like local, and what that means in terms of like thinking about state and then federal and all that good stuff. So what I will say is this, is that I think what is true for at least for me, in terms of like Black communities, and then again gender expansive communities, is that everything has always been mostly local. Like when I think of like an emergency happening in a community, I often think of the response to is often local. So when I was like in Baltimore and thinking about people without housing and what was that, you saw like this really rapid response of, and it was specific to Black trans folks. You saw this rapid mobilization of Black trans people responding to those needs. And it wasn't surprising to me, because I'm just like, well, of course, like who best to meet the needs of a community than that community itself? It's just about how do we resource that community so that way we don't have to constantly be sharing that same $1 bill that's going around, unfortunately, in a GoFundMe. And so, what I'll say is that when I see politicians, especially at the local level, trying to figure out how to solve these issues, so often I'm like, well, look at the community that's been figuring out how to solve these issues for the longest amount of time because they haven't actually been resourced to do the work that they can do if they were resourced properly. And so when, again, being in the midst of COVID-19, when we really started to see the impact that had on the lack of economic stability for many people and how most folks are, part of the gig economy or were underemployed, this, that, and third, you saw the rise of mutual aid funds. You saw the rise of like other ways of like community support versus, with regard to safety nets. And when people were like, oh, well, how do we keep on supporting people? I was like, well, support those things. Like they figured it out. They figured out how to get, specifically aid directly into the hands of the folks who need it the most. So, that's the biggest thing when I'm thinking about the local is like the same holds true for like thinking about how to actually resource the health of a community. When we're talking about food, it's like, look at what's already on the ground. There's no need to build something new, especially when folks have been doing the work. When you're thinking about medical care, well, look at the people who are actually receiving that medical care. Chances are they know best how to actually support themselves or how to actually provide trainings to those doctors, to those providers, to those folks who help with like putting together resource nets. So my biggest thing when I like walk away from places is just like stop looking towards like all these other people, right? I mean, they're great sometimes. Like I should be maybe a little bit too careful with saying that. Like we're great sometimes, but most of the time, like unless you're like deeply ingrained in the community, you're not going to know what's going on. So often I'll take a step back and be like, I actually don't know, but it seems like this community is doing well. And it's not just, and again, and I want to be really careful, this is not to abdicate responsibility in any way. That doesn't give you a get out of, get free pass from doing the work. What it means is that step back and figure out how to resource and let the work do what the work has been doing. So like, that's the biggest thing in terms of like the local work and in terms of like how important it is, especially right now, because there are so many communities that are continuing to thrive because they have had these safety nets in place. And really the big thing that has to be done is like, how do we continue to resource that work and not undermine it? Because they've been doing a good job so long. Why do we need to get involved and mess things up?
Whew. Like following Avatar, I feel like I'm setting myself up for failure. But what I will say is that yes to everything that they just said. And also when we're thinking about the ways that local politics play and have to interplay with like federal policies and regulations, I like to think of, and I'm about to use a road metaphor, and Kim knows I'm the most non-drive-in road metaphor using person. When I think about the ways that these things are set up, the federal policies are like guardrails, right? They're supposed to provide a base level. You're not going to run into some trees. You're not going to run into oncoming traffic. You're going to make sure that the road is straight and headed in the direction it's supposed to go. That's it. Like sometimes I like to think of it that way because there's no way that a country of our size, of our population, of our, I hate the word, but I'm gonna use it, of our diversity, can have one overarching successful way of doing very specific things. We need those federal policies to be very broad and provide those protections that we need so that when we do get down to the local level, we don't have politicians or lawmakers who are able to do things that are going to be directly harmful to our communities. When I think about local things, now I'm thinking about like the actual drivers in the cars, right? Who's using their turn signal, who's speeding, who is reckless. That's what I think about when I think about local politics. And the way in my mind that we can best serve our communities, I agree 1,000% with what Avatara said. There's no way that Aisha, living on the south side of Chicago, is gonna know what someone living in New Orleans needs. I'm not gonna know what someone living in Seattle needs. And even if we share and hold very similar identities, like being queer, like being Black, like being fat, like being femme, it still changes. Because on the south side of Chicago, I can walk down the street and go to a Black-owned coffee shop, a Black-owned restaurant, a Black-owned clothing store. But in Seattle, when I lived there, I didn't have that as an option. It was Starbucks or nothing. It was go to this market or you don't eat. And it's a very specific one. And then when you think about the ways that, like Avatar said, how communities have figured out how to do these things, and how to work with our resources is very important. And we have to figure out how to make sure that we're not forcing communities to continue to figure out how to survive on their own. We shouldn't have to figure out how to make $1 out of 15 cents. We have to hold these folks accountable who are in those spaces, who are holding these resources. Because at the end of the day, what we've seen is that, especially during the pandemic, communities are able to figure out how to survive, and those in power are able to figure out how to continue to maintain that power. We got to disrupt that pattern. We have to make sure that that power is distributed, that those resources are distributed, and that people are able to move out of survival mode, right? Right now we have to maintain and survive, but that should not be continued. That status quo has to be interrupted and stopped for us to get to a future where we're all able to be healthy and thrive.
Yes, I love what both of y'all just said. I mean, you said all the things. One of the things I think about a lot in the work I do is like access and how to make things accessible. And I feel like local politics and local, policymakers and our aldermen and all of those folks feel so accessible in a way that other layers don't. I've definitely been in like a neighborhood block meeting where our alderman is there, and being able to name things and plug things in his ear and like all of this different stuff. Or anytime that I see an empty lot of land, I know the first people I need to go to and talk to about it, but are my community members and then my alderman, right? And those are going to be the folks who are going to start moving things along, right? And so I think about this ability to want to do work or to take care of ourselves or to have some change happen on the level where I'm like the most concerned about in my community, in my neighborhood, in my city, is going to happen through the access of like our local politicians and trying to impact and inform local policy and all of those things. So I think about, that as a way to get involved with local folks. And then I also think about like the ability to choose who are in those offices, like when people talk about vote, all of those things. Yes. And I feel like the most important elections are the small local ones, right? And so like, if you are gonna not miss an election and you're gonna, talk about like our ability to vote, I would say that's where I would want to focus my energy, is in those elections, and who can we put in those places that are in line with our values and our visions and our goals. So I think about that a lot. And then the other thing, as we were saying, there's just so much that made me think about like this kind of, one of the things that from that first question, or the visions of our future, is this very much mutual taking care of ourselves, like what that looks like, to kind of know what we need, and then and know how to provide that for ourselves, right? And so when I think about, Avatara was saying the stuff around like the bigger organizations and groups and how to support, is how do you lift up those folks who are at the community level, who are doing the work that they know that their community needs, and like, whether that's supporting financially, whether that's visibility, because then like as you make those more visible, other places can know how to adapt and create similar models in their neighborhoods, or whether you can network them, all of those things are things I'm looking for, that like as we do the work in this smaller scale or on our community level, we don't have the capacity for, right? But it would be nice to know other people who are doing it, to talk to in these other regions, so I could be like, how did y'all do this? What did you do? And be able to improve and grow as we develop these kind of systems and structures and mutual aid. So I think about that a lot. And when Kim talked about, basically what I heard when you asked the question was like food sovereignty to me, right? Like having control of like our food system, having control. And I think about that sovereignty in other levels, having control of, what we say we need from our medical providers. So we're deciding what food we want to eat and grow. We are kind of, controlling who gets to grow it, who gets to distribute it, like where that is going, what food we get to make out of that, and having that power and that kind of, say so, and how things work feels to me very much like having like a sovereign kind of a free community in that kind of a space. And so I think about that when I think about our community. How do we have our hands and in all of the different pieces of it, right? And so that we could be taking care of ourselves.
Thank you so much to each of you. Angel, I'm going to kick it back to you. I know you have a few words here at the end.
Thank you so much, Kim and panelists, for this amazing, amazing conversation. As I mentioned earlier, today's program was brought to you by Community Health. Any donations you make today will support Community Health's mission to serve those without essential health care. Please consider making a contribution now to support Community Health. Instructions should be appearing on your screen, and you should also find a link in the chat. On behalf of the staff, board of directors, and volunteers at Community Health, I want to thank you all for being part of our All in Chicago event series. I hope that you are leaving today with ideas for how we can work together to make the vision of access to care for all Chicagoans a reality. We have 6 more events coming up throughout the rest of this month, and they are all free to attend. I encourage you to check out our website, allin-chicago.org, to learn more about the great events coming up and register to be all in. We have a critical role to play in this effort. Thank you for being a part of today's event.